Maybe you checked the door twice before leaving the house. Was the stove off? Was the door locked? Some part of you already knew everything was fine, but you turned around anyway and checked one more time. Nothing was wrong. So why can't you feel sure? This isn't just about the door. Maybe it happens before a trip too. You check your suitcase 5 times. Is the charger in there? Is your passport in the bag? Even once you're at the airport, you open the bag one more time to check. Everything really is where it should be, but something inside you won't accept that. Your stomach does a small flutter of doubt, even though logically you already know it's fine. Today we're going to talk about why this happens. And the answer isn't as simple as being careful. By the end of this video, you'll see what this habit is actually trying to protect. And it's a very different thing than you'd expect. Maybe it happens when you're finishing a report, too. You read it 3 times before sending it. Are the numbers right? Is there a typo? You send it. But hours later, it's still there. Did I miss something? Or maybe it happens filling out an official form. You check every box twice, you know you filled it in correctly, but you still can't stop yourself from looking one more time. Or maybe it's money. You make an important payment, the screen confirms it went through, and you still open your banking app 3 or 4 times just to watch the number actually sitting there. People who carry this habit usually seem reliable, organized, well prepared. They never leave a job half done. Co-workers trust them with the details nobody else wants to deal with, the ones where a small slip would actually cost something. Friends quietly rely on them to be the one who remembered the reservation, the one who double-checked the directions, but sometimes that carefulness turns inward. Even after something is finished, the mind won't accept that it's really done, and being the reliable one starts to feel less like a strength and more like a job that never clocks out. Let's be clear about something. This isn't a disorder. It's a fairly common habit. The problem isn't being careful. The problem is that the mind never quite believes I checked enough. And a feeling, no matter how strong, doesn't always carry the right amount of truth. To understand this, picture something. Inside you, there's an inspector on duty. This inspector has one job, doing one last check before anything leaves you, before you walk out the door, before you turn in a piece of work, before you let a message or a payment go out into the world. There's a small, familiar tightness that comes with it, right in the chest, right before you let go of something. So where did this inspector learn to do this job? Research points to something interesting. This habit usually doesn't come from something happening right now. It comes from much further back. If, as a child, a small mistake led to a disproportionately harsh reaction, if forgetting something or getting something wrong meant the household reacted way out of proportion, this feeling today might be part of that. A small child learns one thing: making a mistake is dangerous. So I have to check everything from the start. That's when this inspector starts its job, and what it's actually afraid of isn't even the mistake itself. It's the mistake being noticed, someone seeing it. That's why nothing ever quite feels checked enough. There are a few layers to this. First layer, once this inspector sees one small mistake lead to a big consequence, it turns that into a general rule, and it stops caring whether the situation is actually the same. A forgotten library book as a kid and a forgotten email attachment as an adult get filed under the exact same alarm. Second layer, this inspector never says enough, because for it, there's no such thing as finished. There's only no mistake found yet. You can check something 5 times and the 6th time still feels necessary. Third layer, while trying to protect you, this inspector robs you of ever feeling done. Even when you finish something well, that moment of quiet completion never really arrives because the inspector is already scanning for what comes next. Fourth layer, maybe the subtlest one, the more you check, the more your trust in yourself actually erodes because every check quietly reinforces the message, "See, this can't be trusted without me." The inspector isn't just checking the door, it's slowly convincing you that you never could have checked it right the first time, and that belief is what actually keeps the whole habit running. Notice that the inspector never actually finishes its report, it just moves to the next door, the next email, the next bag. And here's the truly unexpected part. People who have this inspector are usually among the people who make the fewest mistakes because being this careful isn't a flaw. It's a sensitivity. The problem was never the number of mistakes. It's that the inspector never finds it enough. No matter how many times the door was already locked, it's not measuring reality anymore. It's just measuring itself, and it will never score high enough to stop. Has this ever happened to you? Locking a place, then going back to check it one more time? Tell me in the comments because this is far more common than you'd guess, and it's rarely the version of the story people actually say out loud. Changing this has nothing to do with a long list of tips. None of this means you have to stop being careful or that carefulness is the enemy here. Just try one thing. Next time that inspector kicks in, wanting to check a door or a piece of work one more time, quietly ask yourself, have I already checked this? If the answer is yes, stop. Don't check again. Just let yourself sit with a few seconds of discomfort instead. Take the door, for example. Lock it once, say the word locked out loud as you do it, and then walk away without turning back. The discomfort will spike for a moment. That's expected, and it will pass on its own faster than you think. If you don't feed it with one more look, it'll be hard the first time. But every time you do it, you give the inspector new evidence. Once is enough, and nothing goes wrong. Some days it will still win. That's fine too. This isn't about getting it perfect on the first try, which would be a strange thing to ask of an overthinker anyway. Look at that door again. It was locked. It was locked the first time, too. Maybe the only thing missing was reminding that inspector inside you that once is enough. If you're still thinking, but what if, even after finishing something today, remember this. That feeling isn't telling you that you did something wrong. It's just telling you an old habit is still talking, using a voice that's been running since long before you could do anything about it. Habits change slowly, but they really can change, one small, uncomfortable uncheck at a time.